The Shock Doctrine, The Rise of Disaster Capitalism by Naomi Klein is a groundbreaking work that explores how neoliberal policies are often implemented in the wake of crises, whether natural disasters, wars, terrorist attacks, or economic collapses. Published in 2007, this book quickly became influential for its detailed critique of how economic elites exploit disasters to push through controversial free market policies that would otherwise face public resistance. Klein's central argument is that these crises provide the shock needed to implement radical changes that benefit a small elite at the expense of the broader population, a process she terms disaster capitalism. Naomi Klein, a journalist and social critic, presents the shock doctrine as an expose of the methods used by governments and corporations to capitalize on crises. Drawing from decades of historical events, she argues that these moments of shock are deliberately exploited to dismantle public institutions, privatize public assets, and reduce social welfare programs. The book is structured around several case studies that illustrate how this strategy has been employed across the globe, often with devastating consequences for ordinary people. Klein's thesis challenges the conventional wisdom that neoliberal reforms, such as deregulation, privatization, and cuts to social spending, are the result of democratic processes or economic necessity. Instead, she argues that these reforms are typically imposed during moments when our societies are too overwhelmed by crises to resist, using a combination of force, propaganda, and opportunism. Klein begins by drawing an analogy between psychological shock therapy and the economic shock therapy promoted by neoliberal economists. Just as patients in psychiatric wards were subjected to electric shocks to make them more malleable, Klein argues that societies are subjected to economic shocks to make them more compliant. Klein describes how neoliberal economists, particularly those influenced by Milton Friedman and the Chicago School of Economics, advocate for shock therapy as a way to rapidly transform economies. This approach involves implementing rapid-fire reforms such as mass privatization, deregulation, and deep cuts to social spending immediately following a crisis before people have time to recover and organize resistance. Klein discusses how in the 1970s, after a military coup in Chile ousted the democratically elected government of Salvador Allende, the new regime led by Augusto Pinochet implemented a series of radical free market reforms based on the ideas of Milton Friedman. These reforms were introduced at a time where Chilean society was in a state of shock due to the coup and subsequent violence, making resistance difficult. A central focus of Klein's analysis is the rise of neoliberalism, a political economic theory that favors free market capitalism, deregulation, and reduction in government spending. Klein traces the intellectual roots of neoliberalism to the Chicago School of Economics, and particularly to Milton Friedman, who believed that economic freedom was a necessary condition for political freedom. Klein details how, under Friedman's guidance, a group of Chilean economists known as the Chicago Boys were trained at the University of Chicago and later returned to Chile to implement neoliberal policies after Pinochet's coup. This experiment became a model for neoliberal reform worldwide, demonstrating how economic shocks could be used to implement radical changes. Klein argues that the spread of neoliberalism has often been accompanied by shocks, whether engineered or opportunistically seized upon. These shocks destabilize societies and make it easier to implement reforms that would be impossible under normal democratic conditions. The book details how, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia underwent a similar process of shock therapy under the guidance of Western economists. Massive privatizations and market liberalizations were implemented almost overnight, leading to widespread poverty, corruption, and a dramatic decline in living standards. Klein uses a series of detailed case studies to illustrate her argument that crises are exploited to push through neoliberal policies. These case studies span continents and decades, showing how disaster capitalism operates in different contexts. Klein examines how the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans was used to implement privatization and deregulation policies, In the wake of the disaster, public housing was demolished, public schools were replaced with charter schools, and the city's healthcare system was largely dismantled. Klein argues that these changes were not aimed at rebuilding New Orleans for its residents, but at transforming it into a model of free market reform. Klein also describes how the invasion of Iraq and the subsequent occupation were used as opportunities for privatization and deregulation on an unprecedented scale. She discusses how the US government awarded no-bid contracts to American corporations for the reconstruction of Iraq, which often involved privatizing key sectors of the Iraqi economy, such as oil and telecommunications. This corporate invasion was justified as necessary for Iraq's recovery, but primarily served American corporate interests. Next, the book discusses how the Asian financial crisis was used by international financial institutions like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank to impose stringent economic reforms on affected countries. These reforms included the privatization of state-owned enterprises, deregulation of financial markets, and huge cuts to social spending. Klein argues that these measures were more about opening markets to foreign investors than about helping countries recover. Klein argues that disaster capitalism is not only a product of opportunistic corporations, but also requires the active involvement of governments, often through policies that enable or directly promote such exploitation. Klein highlights how governments, particularly those influenced by neoliberal ideology, are complicit in disaster capitalism. They often use crises to dismantle public services and sell off state assets to private companies at bargain prices, under the guise of efficiency and economic recovery. Klein points out that privatization of disaster response and even warfare itself has become a hallmark of disaster capitalism. She discusses how private military contractors like Blackwater were heavily involved in Iraq, and how private companies have increasingly taken over roles traditionally performed by public institutions, such as disaster relief and emergency management. Klein details the role of private military companies and contractors in the Iraq War, where firms like Halliburton and Blackwater profited enormously from contracts that often lacked oversight and accountability. This outsourcing of war efforts to private corporations, she argues, represents a new form of capitalism that thrives on conflict and chaos. Klein also explores the psychological effects of shock doctrine policies on societies. She argues that these policies often lead to widespread trauma, social disintegration, and a breakdown of community solidarity. By exploiting crises, disaster capitalism induces a state of collective shock that disorients society, making them more susceptible to manipulation and control. This state of disorientation is further exploited to push through unpopular reforms. Klein argues that the shock doctrine erodes democratic institutions by bypassing normal processes of debate, consultation, and consent. In the aftermath of the shock, decisions are often made by unelected technocrats or imposed by external institutions like the International Monetary Fund, undermining democratic accountability. Klein discusses the Argentine financial crisis of the early 2000s, where austerity measures imposed by the International Monetary Fund led to widespread social unrest and the collapse of several governments. This disorientation and hardship experienced by ordinary Argentinians were used to justify further cuts to public services and privatizations, deepening the crisis. The shock doctrine is a powerful critique of the ways in which crises are exploited to implement neoliberal policies. Klein's work challenges the notion that such policies are the inevitable result of market forces or democratic choices, instead revealing a deliberate strategy to use moments of collective vulnerability to advance corporate and elite interests. For readers interested in understanding the dynamics of contemporary capitalism, Klein's book offers a critical lens through which to view economic and political developments. It provides a framework for analysing how policies that increase inequality and reduce public control are often implemented under the guise of crisis management. Klein's analysis is particularly relevant today as we face a multitude of crises, from pandemics to climate change, where the temptation to use shock tactics to impose radical economic change is ever present. The shock doctrine encourages us to remain vigilant and to advocate for democratic accountability and social justice, especially in times of crisis. We have been the Left Library, and this has been Political Theory Simplified. If you have enjoyed this overview, we encourage you to read The Shock Doctrine, The Rise of Disaster Capitalism by Naomi Klein to better understand the mechanics of disaster capitalism and its impact on societies worldwide. Thank you again for watching. Let's continue to learn and to grow together.